catheter-associated bloodstream infections and catheter-associated urinary tract infections. So today we're going to discuss about nosocomial infections, and in this talk I'm going to cover catheter-associated bloodstream infections and catheter-associated urinary tract infections with a little bit of mention about asymptomatic bacteriuria. Let's first start talking about the catheter-associated bloodstream infections in the ICU. As you all know, hospital-acquired infections affects millions and millions of people worldwide. This is data from the West which says that almost 1.5 million people every year are affected by some kind of a hospital-acquired infection. It has become an enormous burden economically and for insurance purposes, to the point where in the US, insurance companies do not reimburse if you develop a hospital-acquired infection during your ICU stay. Hence, it becomes very important for us to prevent it and then subsequently try to address it and get the patients better as fast as possible. So how about the incidence of these infections in our country? I'm just going to show you some data. This is from the Rosenthal study in 2006, where they looked at almost 55 ICUs in 46 hospitals in developing countries, including India. They looked at almost 21,000 patients, and they found that the overall incidence rate, as you can see, is got 15% chances of a catheter-related bloodstream infection. And once you develop a catheter-related bloodstream infection, the mortality rate seems to be somewhere around 35%, which is very, very high. So it becomes a very common problem and also seems to be extremely important in terms of doing this. How about only India? This is a study that we have collected data. It's not yet published, but I'm just sharing you here that here you can see that the ventilator-associated pneumonia rates are about 65% of all the ICU infections. 2/3 are ventilator-associated pneumonia. Almost 1/4 seem to be CRBSI, and a small proportion seem to be COTY. And if you look at the mortality, our mortality of catheter-related bloodstream infections is very similar to what the Rosenthal study showed. It's almost 35% mortality because almost all of these patients are bacteremic compared to the other infections. And if you just look at the 6 months follow-up which we did, 2/3 of the patients are alive at the end of 6 months. About 10% are dead, and the other 30% we have lost to follow-up in our study. But at least you know that there is a reasonable survival if you can get them out of the hospital over the next 6-month period. What are the common organisms causing CRBSI in our country? Again, the data from Moses study sponsored by the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. If you look at the common bugs, the number one bug is probably Klebsiella in our study, which is expected, followed by Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter, which is not a surprise. The point I want to make very clearly is you don't see gram positives here in my slide at all. It forms a very, very small proportion of the organisms that cause catheter-related bloodstream infections. Right after the 3 gram negatives comes E. coli in Candida. Candida obviously is a common bug that we need to be careful about. In terms of mortality, as you would expect, Pseudomonas bacteremia has the highest mortality, followed by Acinetobacter and Candida. So clearly the impact of catheter-related infections in our country seems to be gram negatives, followed by fungus, and a very small proportion by gram positives. This is important because if you are considering a catheter-related bloodstream infection in your ICU, your empiric antibiotic coverage should be either catered towards multi-drug resistant gram negatives in the appropriate situation and fungus, rather than trying to treat gram positives, unlike the Western guidelines. So should I use the word catheter-related bloodstream infection? Should I use CLABSI, which is central line associated bloodstream infection? There's a subtle difference which I think a lot of the trainees sometimes don't get it, but here clearly will tell you that CRBSI is a very rigorous clinical definition. You need to meet a lot of criteria to say somebody has a catheter-related bloodstream infection. It is defined by precise lab findings that identify the central venous line specifically as the source of the bloodstream infection. On the other hand, CLABSI, or central line associated bloodstream infection, is more of a surveillance definition where you can have a little bit of a looser definition, and all it says is there is a patient who's got a bloodstream infection in somebody who's got a central line, and we don't find any other reason. It doesn't have to be a very, very strict definition. Obviously, when you have this kind of a loose definition, you're going to overestimate the incidence of central line associated bloodstream infection. When you're looking at it from a surveillance point of view, overestimation is not a bad thing, because you still want to try to control the infections and keep it under a certain level, threshold level of the international benchmark. So therefore, it may not be a bad thing. You just need to know the subtle differences between those two things. So how do I define central line related bloodstream infection? Patient should have one of the following. Very clearly here it's shown that if you have a catheter tip culture, a quantitative catheter tip culture, more than 15 colony forming units per catheter segment, or you can have a quantitative more than 10 power 2 colony forming units in the catheter segment along with the same organism that is identified in the peripheral blood. So you can either have only 10 power 5 in the catheter segment alone or 10 power 2 in the catheter segment in association with the peripheral blood which has the same organism and sensitivity like what we have cultured. If you simultaneously culture the quantitative blood culture central versus peripheral, then you need a quantitative culture ratio of more than 5:1. The central line should have 5 times more growth than the peripheral stick. That again is suggestive. Or if the central line becomes more positive in terms of blood culture 2 hours or earlier, much before than the peripheral line, then again we say differential positivity of more than 2 hours strongly indicates the presence of a catheter related bloodstream infection. How about CLABSI? All I need for a CLABSI is there is a patient has a bloodstream infection, a primary bloodstream infection in any patient who has a central line or had a central line within a 48-hour window where I don't find any other cause of that primary bacteremia. In other words, somebody has a bacteremia, he or she already has a central line, or the central line was removed within a 48-hour window and I can't find any other cause of the bloodstream infection, then I'm going to call it as a CLABSI. I don't need a rigorous quantitative cultures for me to say somebody has a CLABSI. That becomes very, very important. And according to CDC, you don't need to have the central line for any minimum period. Patient could have had a central line only for 1 day, or he could have had a central line for 5 days. If the patient had a central line and within 48 hours you have a bloodstream infection and you cannot attribute this infection to anything else, then that patient will fit into CLABSI and there is no minimum period required. So this is more of a qualitative definition for surveillance, makes it very easy, practical at the bedside for us to diagnose CLABSI rather than going through the rigorous quantitative cultures that are necessary to define CRBSI as we saw earlier. And the culture of the catheter tip is not a criterion. When you're talking about CLABSI, you do not need to culture the catheter tip. You just need to have a bloodstream infection in a patient who's got a central line. So next, talking about the risk factors for central line associated bacterial infections. There are several risk factors. I'm just going to list it here. Number 1, what are the circumstances of insertion? You can see that emergency lines obviously are done in a less sterile way than elective lines and they are going to be at a higher risk. The skill of the inserter, if he's a generalist or a general medical person putting a line versus a specialist like an intensivist putting a line, then the risk of infection goes up. Insertion site clearly has been shown to be associated with a higher risk of infections. Femorals have a higher chance of infection. Skin antisepsis becomes very, very important. Povidone iodine is no more recommended. You need to have at least a 2% chlorhexidine solution or a 70% alcohol solution if somebody is allergic to chlorhexidine, and then you need to do a very good skin antisepsis. And the more number of lumens you have, if you have a quad lumen catheter, it's got a higher risk than a double lumen catheter versus a single lumen catheter. So the more number of lumens, more likely you're going to get infected. If you leave the catheter long enough, as you can see, it's going to have a higher risk of infection. So the goal would be to reassess every day and try to remove the line as quickly as possible. We'll talk about barrier precautions in detail because I think that is a very salient part of trying to prevent bloodstream infection as we go on. So we will look at it. So next, talking about prevention, what can I do? First is education. They are talking about preventing, what are the measures necessary preventing in terms of the physicians involved, the nurses involved, the technicians involved, and anybody who's involved in the ICU in terms of participating in the line. We need to constantly do surveillance of our ICU infections and try to look at practices and modify them as we go. Antisepsis becomes the most important factor that we need to do to prevent central line infections, of which number 1, the easiest and the cheapest to do would be hand hygiene. The doctor inserting the line should at least cleanse himself until the elbow very, very clearly with at least a 4% chlorhexidine solution. Then the patient should be cleansed with, the site should be cleansed very, very clearly and broadly with at least a 2% chlorhexidine solution. Povidone iodine, as I mentioned earlier, is not recommended routinely. If somebody is allergic to chlorhexidine, you could use a 70% alcohol solution. That becomes very important. Irrespective of what line we do, we may do a small radial arterial line. You still need to do full barrier precautions. When I say full barrier precautions, it is 5 barriers: cap, mask, gown, gloves, and a full body drape. Even if you're going to do a small radial line, the recommendation is to do a full body drape to minimize infections. That needs to be done. And the technique of inserting a line, the Seldinger technique, should be as aseptic as possible and be very, very careful about the whole thing. In terms of facilitating the proper insertion, it always helps if you have a line cart or some kind of a kit that everything is available in one place so that the doctor doesn't have to run around. The compliance of following such a protocol becomes a lot more easier when everything is in one place. Use of a checklist now routinely is recommended by a lot of organizations. Before you put the line, during you put the line, and once you put the line, you come back and make sure that you've ticked off all the things that are necessary so that patient gets the best possible care. And empowering the nursing staff and the ancillary staff to stop the line or stop the insertion in a non-emergent situation if any of these previous procedures that we had discussed are basically not being followed. Usually the nurses stand by just letting the doctor go, but I think we need to empower the nurses to say, look, we need to stop here because the full barrier is not being followed and the line needs to be done in a very, very sterile way, hopefully promote the safety culture. So we'll talk about the central line related bundles. We have the insertion bundle, we talked about the hand hygiene, we talked about the maximal barrier precautions, chlorhexidine skin antisepsis both for the doctor and for the patient, and we need to make sure that we select the catheter site appropriately. I will talk about the catheter site selection in the subsequent slide. Once the catheter is in, we have to do certain things to make sure that we minimize the chances of an infection. The first and foremost would be to daily look at the need for the central line and decide whether we can remove the central line or not. Number two, make sure that if we are going to use total parenteral nutrition, we have a dedicated lumen that has not been used before for any other purposes so that we can do that. We need to educate our nurses how to access the lumens in a very sterile way. We will talk about sterilization of the hub in a minute. And then we need to be able to look at the entry site very carefully every single day and see if there is any inflammation or redness there, and then decide whether to leave the line in or take it every single day. Two things I'm going to stress again are the full body drape. We need to make sure that for every line, even if it is a small local arterial line, we need to follow full body drapes. Number two, the common mistakes again done are all the ports have to be capped by the physician before the line is over and coming out. Commonly you see that the doctor puts the line in, just puts the lock and comes out, and the nurses go back later and subsequently cap the port, cap the various lumens, which is probably not acceptable in terms of preventing line infection. So make sure that if you're going to put the line in, so we make sure we cap it appropriately. In terms of the site selection, this is a recent study published in New England Journal of Medicine last year, where they compared central lines placed in the subclavian, jugular, and femoral. There were about 850 patients across each of the arms. What they found is the percentage of catheters with complications. When I say complications, they included mechanical complications, DVT, bloodstream infections. Putting all those together, as you can very, very clearly see, subclavian site seems to be the most favorable. So for any venous catheter except a dialysis catheter, the recommended site is going to be subclavian. Obviously, if the patient is a dialysis patient and needs dialysis, subclavian should be avoided because you can cause subclavian stenosis, which can preclude you from using that particular arm for an AV fistula in the long term if the patient ends up on long-term hemodialysis. So that's the only reason. Otherwise, for all non-emergent lines in a non-coagulopathic patient, we should probably go for a subclavian line to minimize the number of complications as per this particular study. So prefer subclavian site, jugular and femoral only for dialysis catheters. Ultrasound guidance improves the safety of the procedure. The current recommendation is if you're going to do a line, you might as well use ultrasound. Even subclavian lines can be done under ultrasound guidance in a very, very safe way, so we need to do that. Once the line is done, the sterile gauze or a sterile transparent semi-permeable dressing is probably put. There is no difference between a sterile gauze and a sterile transparent dressing. The other key important point I want to stress is there is absolutely no role for prophylactic antibiotics just because patient has a central line. A common misconception among surgical ICUs and surgeons is that just because patients has lines and tubes, we need to give antibiotics. That is not recommended to prevent any infection at this particular time. In terms of maintenance, we need to look at dressing change. We need to look at if there is a gauze dressing, we need to change it every 2 days. If it is a transparent dressing, we need to change it every 7 days or whenever it is soiled. We need to be able to look at the site every day and palpate it so that through the intact dressing, we don't have to take the dressing, through the intact dressing we can take a look and see whether there is site is red or any palpable tenderness. If it is a gauze dressing, obviously we can't look through it, so we may have to just palpate and see. There is no signs of inflammation, then we don't need to do anything. Remove the catheter as soon as possible. That's another fundamental aspect of trying to minimize the infections. and if there is an IV administrator, IV set that has been hanging, the recommendation is remove the administrator set no more frequently than 96 hours, which means you do not have to change it routinely within every 4 days, but you can't leave it for 1 week. So probably somewhere around 4 to 5 days is a reasonable period of time for you to remove the IV set or change the IV set, unless there is contamination or soiling of that particular IV set, then we change it. Okay. Do not, if the patient already has a central line, the key is scrub the hub. Make sure that every single hub is cleaned with chlorhexidine solution prior to being accessed by the nurses. This is something important for the nurses to be educated about, so that they go and do it routinely and access these hubs in a very sterile way as possible. In terms of diagnosis of the central line, I'm going to divide them into two particular categories. The first category is removing the catheter for diagnosis. So here what we can do is we can just do a qualitative blood culture through the device. Just draw the blood through the device and see if there's any growth at all of the bacteria. If there's any growth, you could consider that the patient has probably a bloodstream infection associated with the central line. But as you can see, it is not very sensitive, it's not very specific, because it can be bacteremia from other sources that you're picking up, and it may not necessarily diagnose central line related bacterial infection. On the other hand, you can do quantitative blood cultures. We can draw it through the central line, and the central line can be processed in various ways. So you can either have a more than 100 colony forming unit through the central catheter, and if you have the same bug through a peripheral catheter, then that marks an infection. You can see the sensitivity goes down because we are using quantitative culture, but it becomes more and more specific. It becomes 90% specific at this point, that you can very clearly see. Second, I can do a paired quantitative blood culture. I can draw one set from the central line, one set from the peripheral line, and then look at them quantitatively. If the ratio is more than 5:1, which means the central line growth is 5 times more than the peripheral growth, or if the central line turns positive more than 2 hours than the peripheral line, the differential time to positivity is more than 2 hours, both are strongly indicative of central line related bloodstream infections. When you use a quantitative paired sample, you can see the sensitivity becomes very good. The specificity is nearly 100%, almost 98% there, so that makes it very, very specific for a central line related infection. However, there are a lot of times where I may have to remove the catheter. If I remove the catheter, then there are certain things that I can do. The first and foremost would be a qualitative catheter segment culture. What I mean by a qualitative catheter segment culture is, I'm going to remove the catheter, send it for culture, and then leave it at that. Any growth is going to imply that the line is infected. This has got a very high sensitivity but not a very good specificity, because you could pick up contamination or a colonizer in the line port, so that becomes important. Second, I can do a semi-quantitative catheter segment culture, where I'm going to take a 5 centimeter segment of the catheter. When I say a segment, it should be the catheter tip. It's not the subcutaneous segment of the catheter. So make sure that it's very, very clear. We're going to take the catheter tip and put 5 centimeters of that in the culture. And we look at more than 15 colony forming units. It's got a reasonable sensitivity and specificity. Or I can do a quantitative catheter segment culture, where the central line is flushed and sonicated, and if there is more than 1000 colony forming units, you could diagnose. But you can see that these techniques do not give a very high sensitivity and a very high specificity. I know there are a lot of tests which probably make you confused. I'm going to summarize at the end and tell you probably the 2 or 3 tests that we need to know to diagnose central line related infections. When you're talking about catheter tip culture, remember that routine catheter tip culture is not recommended at all. If we strongly suspect a CRBSI and you want to prove CRBSI, then we can do it. But like I said earlier, if it's only for a surveillance purpose, we do not need to remove the catheter. We can just call it a CLAPC, where the catheter tip culture is not necessary. Remember that qualitative broth culture of the catheter tip yield is not very, very good, and you're going to pick up a lot of colonizers, and hence it is not recommended by the most recent IDSA guidelines. If you are going to do a catheter tip, you probably need to do a semi-quantitative or a quantitative broth culture. If there is an anti-infective catheter tip, the antibiotic coated catheter tip, then we have to make sure that the culture media has specific inhibitors for those antiseptics or anti-infectives, so that you do have true positivity. And there are different techniques in terms of keeping the broth, and the technique that is recommended is roll plate rather than sonication. Roll plate is they're just going to roll the catheter on the culture. Sonication is just vibrating it using an ultrasound machine. That is generally not recommended. A roll plate technique is easy enough to do and is as effective as the sonication technique, and that's probably more than enough. So finally, to sum up, how do I diagnose CRBSI? I'm going to diagnose it if, one, percutaneous blood culture from a quantitative is more than 15 forming units culture of the tip. So meaning if I going to remove the catheter and I'm going to culture the tip, if there is more than 15 colony forming units, then that tells me it's very important. 2, differential time to positivity. When I have a central venous catheter culture and a peripheral venous culture, if the central venous culture turns positive 2 hours before, it becomes very important, or the central to peripheral ratio is more than 5:1 if you do a quantitative culture. But most labs do not end up doing quantitative cultures, and hence we just only get qualitative cultures, and that is the reason why CLABSI becomes a more pragmatic definition rather than specifically going for CRBSI, which needs this kind of stringent criteria for us to diagnose. So in terms of how to take blood cultures, I want to make sure that blood culture should be taken prior to initiation of antibiotic therapy for maximal yield. At least 2 sets of blood cultures. 1 set of blood culture is never adequate. 2 sets of blood cultures, preferably even 3, sometimes is necessary for us to do it. If there is a specialized phlebotomy team to do peripheral cultures, obviously that is better because they do it more sterilely than otherwise. Most important thing is same volume of blood cultures have to be put in all the bottles, because if you put more volume in one bottle and less volume in the other, then your differential positivity doesn't make sense, because obviously the culture bottle which has more blood is going to grow faster. So that's something that we need to pay attention to, and make sure that if there is no peripheral venous stick is available, you draw from 2 different lumens so that you hopefully get a reasonable sample. And remember that the positive predictive value and the specificity is going to be very, very high when one culture is drawn from central and one drawn from peripheral. Obviously, because if the peripheral is also positive, then they are more likely that you have a true catheter related bloodstream infection. On the other hand, to just say there is no infection, the negative predictive value is very good, even if I can just do a culture only from a central catheter or only from either a peripheral or a central venous catheter. I don't need to do both. So to have a higher positive predictive value, I need to do 1 central line culture, 1 peripheral culture. For a good negative predictive value, it doesn't matter. As long as the cultures are negative, most likely I don't have a significant bloodstream associated infection. Before I draw a culture, I need to make sure the skin area is decontaminated, again with either a chlorhexidine solution. Povidone iodine should be avoided, or a high amount of alcohol, 70% alcohol solution should be used. Should give adequate skin contact time, adequately dried before the percutaneous stick is done, otherwise there is a very good chance of contamination and you picking up colonizers, and we need to be very, very careful. If the culture is being drawn through the center line, the hub has to be cleaned appropriately with chlorhexidine or the alcohol solution, and then go from there. So now I've diagnosed CRBSI, or I'm suspecting CRBSI. Should I remove the catheter? This is kind of a busy slide. I'm just going to quickly tell you what this slide means. The first question I'm going to ask myself is the patient mild or moderately ill, or is this patient seriously ill? When I say mild or moderately ill, this patient should not have hypotension. This patient should not have any organ failure like delirium, DIC, renal failure, mottling, any of that. If the patient has hypotension or organ failure, then the catheter comes out automatically. If the patient has only got mild or moderate, where there is no hypotension or no organ failure, then there is no immediate need to take the catheter out. You could just send 2 blood cultures, 1 from the central line, 1 preferably peripheral, and you consider antimicrobial therapy based on the clinical context of that particular patient. If the blood cultures are negative and the line obviously has not been removed, if the patient is getting better, now the cultures are negative, then we can go on. If the cultures are negative but the patient is still not improving, then I would still go ahead and take the cultures out. I'm talking about the group where they are not hypotensive or having any organ hypoperfusion at this point of time. On the other hand, if the patient is seriously ill, I'm going to take the culture out as quickly as possible, take the catheter out as quickly as possible, beg your pardon, and then I'm going to do 2 blood cultures, 1 through the central line prior to removing the line, 1 through the peripheral line. I'm going to remove the central venous catheter or the arterial catheter and consider sending the culture, the tip for culture, if I strongly suspect CRBSI, and then follow the patient. And obviously, since the patient is shocky, I'm going to start appropriate antimicrobial therapy based on local sensitivity pattern. Now, you can have 2 things. 1, the blood culture is negative, the catheter tip is negative, in which case the source of bacteremia is not the catheter, so you can move along and look for other sources. If the blood culture is positive and the catheter is negative, then we need to think whether the catheter itself is the source of infection or is there anything else. Obviously, if both the blood culture and the catheter tip culture come back positive with the same organism, then more likely you're dealing with the catheter related bloodstream infection, then we need to treat them appropriately as much. And how long do I treat? Depends on the organism I'm going to culture, which I'm going to talk in the next slide. So when I'm talking about culture positive patients, the first question I'm going to ask is it a complicated infection or an uncomplicated infection? What I mean by a complicated infection, as you can see in the left hand corner, is if I suspect endocarditis, septic thrombophlebitis or osteomyelitis, it is considered as a complicated infection where I definitely need to remove the catheter. I need to consider antibiotic therapy for at least 4 to 6 weeks. If it is osteomyelitis, maybe even 8 weeks. Leaving the catheter in is not an option, and we need to take the catheter out right away. On the other hand, if it is an uncomplicated infection, when I talk about complicated infection, it doesn't matter what bug I grow, I need to take the catheter out. When I talk about an uncomplicated infection where I am not worried about endocarditis, osteomyelitis or a septic thrombophlebitis or any abscesses, then I look at the organism. If I have a coagulase negative staph, that is the only condition where I may be allowed to leave the catheter in, treat the patient with antibiotics plus or minus an antibiotic lock kind of a therapy if necessary, and then reassess the patient. If the patient is improving, you can leave the catheter in. If the patient is not improving in about 3 days, then you generally take the catheter out. But if you are going to leave the catheter in, maybe a repeat culture is probably reasonable in about 48 to 72 hours after therapy. I want to be clear again, if this is an uncomplicated infection and you are growing corns, that is the only time where you probably are okay to leave the catheter and then continue with antibiotic therapy. For all other organisms, for practical purposes, the recommendation is to remove the catheter right away and then continue the antibiotic therapy, especially Staph aureus. Remove the catheter, antibiotic therapy for at least 2 weeks. If there is endocarditis, osteomyelitis, then obviously duration will be longer. If it is enterococci, then again I'm going to remove the catheter. Gram negative, remove the catheter. Candida, remove the catheter. So in all those conditions I'm going to remove the catheter, treat for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer depending on the circumstance. If it is an uncomplicated infection, then again what we can do is treat with appropriate antibiotic therapy. If it is an uncomplicated infection with cons, you can probably leave the catheter in for a little bit longer and then treat them appropriately. What empiric therapy would I give? Like I showed you in our epidemiological data, the most common bugs we see are gram negatives, which are probably MDR gram negatives in our setup. So you should know the local flora that cause infection in your particular ICU, the susceptibility pattern, the disease severity. I look at all these three. If it's an immunocompromised host, the patient is really, really sick, I'm going to treat for MDR gram negatives. If the patient is very, very healthy, not immunocompromised, non-shocky, then maybe I can just treat with a broad spectrum gram negative antibiotic like a carbapenem rather than treating MDRs. I would use combination therapy if the patient is in severe shock, if the patient is neutropenic, if he already is colonized with that gram negative bug or any other bug that we already know, then I would be more aggressive in giving them combination therapy at that point of time. Gram positives make a very, very small proportion. In one of my first slides, I didn't even show you gram positives because it contributes to less than 5 to 10% of all the catheter related infections in our country. And if you do come across a Staph aureus infection, I would look for the vancomycin MIC. Any vancomycin MIC above 2, clearly we think it's we call it VISA, vancomycin intermediate Staph aureus, and we need to use alternate drugs like daptomycin. This MIC cutoff has been coming down. So for all practical purposes, if the vancomycin MIC is more than 1, the recommendation is not to use vancomycin for Staph aureus infections. Linezolid should not be used empirically. Without knowing the bug, linezolid should not be used empirically to cover for catheter related infections because it has been associated with increased mortality, and it's a strong recommendation from IDSA not to routinely use linezolid. How about Candida cover? If the patient has got a high risk for Candida, how would I know? If I use the line for a TPN, if there is a femoral catheter, if the patient has Candida colonization in 2 or more sites, he's got a hematological malignancy, he's been in the ICU having a lot of antibiotics, or if it's an organ transplant recipient who is at a high risk, I would consider empiric Candida therapy in patients where I suspect a bloodstream infection. And the current recommendation is, if the patient, irrespective of whether the patient is hemodynamically stable or unstable, an echinocandin is preferred than than an azole antifungal therapy at this point of time. And obviously economics has to play a role. You need to check if the patient can afford. If the patient can afford, I would directly go with an echinocandin, identify the bug. Once the patient is better, de-escalate to an azole antibiotic. Even if your ICU commonly has a candida that is sensitive to the azole, echinocandin seem to be better earlier on compared to azole antifungals based on current evidence. When do I do catheter salvage? As I told you earlier, only once, especially when there is cons and the patient has got an uncomplicated infection. I'm going to leave the catheter in and salvage the catheter, but I need to do additional blood cultures 48 to 72 hours. I need to start antibiotics if necessary, antibiotic lock therapy. I'm not going into the details of antibiotic lock therapy, but all I want to say is antibiotic lock therapy as a sole treatment is inadequate. It also always has to be done in addition to systemic antibiotic therapy, and that is recommended only for cons at this point of time. If the repeat blood cultures are positive or the patient is not improving, then the catheter should come out within 2 to 3 days after starting this therapy. How about long-term tunneled hemodialysis catheters? I think this is something we commonly see. Rather than talking about other long-term catheters, I would like to talk about hemodialysis catheters. We can only obtain peripheral venous cultures, but remember that try to use an arm which is not going to be used for an AV fistula subsequently when you do the culture. If the culture is negative, obviously you discontinue the antibiotics. If the culture is positive and the patient is symptomatic, I think then we need to continue the antibiotics. Remove the catheter if the culture is growing Pseudomonas, Staph aureus or Candida. These are bad bugs. If you have Staph aureus, Pseudomonas or Candida, then the recommendation is to remove the long-term dialysis catheter and not just treat it appropriately. Again, this is the recommendation, but practically you need to weigh the risk benefit. There may be patients who are a very, very difficult access and you may not be able to get catheters, where you may have to play the risk benefit and then decide. But the recommendation is if you grow Pseudomonas, Staph or Candida, remove the long-term dialysis catheter. Place a new catheter only after the blood cultures are sterilized. You should not be doing it right away. You need to make sure you give antibiotics, repeat cultures. If the culture is negative, then consider putting the new catheter. If the catheter is retained, for some reason you think it is a difficult venous access and you want to retain the tunnel catheter, then surveillance culture should be done 1 week after completion of the course of antibiotics. Let's say I'm going to treat the patient for 2 weeks, then finish the course of antibiotic, wait for 1 more week and then repeat the culture if the patient is improving. If the patient is not improving, we need to take the line out and figure out alternate sources of dialysis access. I'm not going to go into detail for antibiotic lock therapy, but all I want to say is it can never be used as a sole modality of treatment. It is recommended in combination with systemic antibiotic therapy only when you have an uncomplicated infection with cons. Going on to the next part of my talk is going to be catheter-associated urinary tract infection and asymptomatic bacteriuria. Any patient who has an indwelling Foley catheter in place at the time or within the 48 hours of the infection is classified as catheter-associated urinary tract infection. Like a central line infection, there is no minimum period of time that the catheter must be in place before you can diagnose CORT. Patient could have the Foley catheter for 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, doesn't matter. If the patient has a catheter, develops the symptoms of urinary tract, I will show you the specific criteria, then you specifically say this patient has a catheter-associated urinary tract infection. You can have a symptomatic catheter-associated urinary infection or an asymptomatic. We'll just go through the algorithm. So the first is the patient has an indwelling urinary catheter at the time of specimen collection, or the patient had a catheter within 48 hours. The first thing you need to have is symptoms. Patient should have fever, should have suprapubic tenderness or a costovertebral angle tenderness or tenderness. You should have some kind of symptom, fever in the ICU for you to think of urinary tract as a source of infection. Once you have that, you could have two specific criteria. One, I need to have a positive urine analysis, or I need to have more than 10 to the power of 5 organisms with no more than 2 species. I should not have no more than 2 species. If there's more than 2 species, it's most likely a contaminant and I should not be treating it. So the first criteria is I should be symptomatic. The second is I should have a positive UA or a 10 to the power 5 of colony forming units in terms of not having more than 2 species. On the other hand, the second criteria is I can have a positive UA and 10 power 3. Because you have a positive UA, the threshold for the quantitative culture is dropped from 10 to the power 5 to 10 power 3. To simplify it, all patients should have symptoms. If you directly culture, should have more than 10 to the power of 5 organisms for you to diagnose CORT. But on the other hand, If you have only 10 power 3, then 10 power 3 along with a positive UA qualifies as a catheter associated urinary tract infection. If the patient is with or without an indwelling Foley catheter, it doesn't matter what age, we need to have significant symptoms. Symptoms is a must. Some symptom is a must. Then we need to look for a positive urine culture of more than 10 to the power 5 with no more than 2 organisms, and then have a blood culture positive. Then we are going to call it as a bacteremic patient. If the same patient has bacteremia, then we call it bacteremic patient. What are the common bugs causing it? In our country, you can see that about 12% of all ICU acquired infections are Akati. Their mortality is not very, very high. Usually it's more benign than the other hospital acquired infections. Mortality is about 12%. Again, 6-month survival is almost 60% like other infections. The common organisms we see in India, predominantly gram negatives, and Canada, as you can see, Klebsiella E. coli, now that you would guess very easily, followed by Candida, then Pseudomonas and Enterococcus. So it makes sense that those are the common bacteria that are there in the urinary tract, and you're going to get infections from that. So common is again gram negatives with Klebsiella and E. coli. The point I want to make here is more and more Klebsiellas are carbapenem resistant now in India, and you need to be factoring that when you start empiric antibiotic therapy in your patients. The mortality is going to be variable depending on the organism that we pick. In terms of interpreting the urinary culture, you should not have more than 2 organisms. If the urinary culture has more than 2 organisms, it's usually a contaminant, and that culture should not be interpreted and treated. Then how do I define the 2 organisms? I need to be very, very clear in terms of how I define. Organisms of the same genus but different species are considered 2 organisms. For example, I have a Pseudomonas aeruginosa and a Pseudomonas stutzeri. Then they are considered as 2 different organisms, even though they have the same genus. There are 2 different species. So that would qualify as 2 organisms. However, the same organism, you have the same organism but 2 different microbial sensitivities. One, let's say, sensitive to X antibiotic and the other resistant. You would still call it as 1 organism. And the next thing you need to make sure is if there is any mixed flora, that urine culture should not be routinely interpreted and thrown away. In terms of risk factors, this is a very clear fishbone analysis. Obviously there are patient related risk factors: elderly, diabetic, sickles, immobilized, previous UTI, colonization, all that, fecal incontinence, all that is going to contribute to UTI. In terms of caregiver related factors, it's more of how we handle. Sometimes we lift the bag, urinary bag, above the level of the Foley. That is going to be important. Poor insertion technique, breaks in the closed system, all those are going to be contributing to the UTI. In terms of the hospital system, inappropriate use, routinely changing catheters, and inappropriate antibiotic use, all are probably going to add on to the burden risk. Again, in terms of systems and environment, no breaks in the closed system, no sample port, and open drainage systems, and all those probably contribute to the UTI in the ICU patient. The pathogenesis, usually the source of microorganisms is endogenous. Usually it's in the urethral meatus, rectum or vagina that colonizes. It either comes from above or below and colonizes the urinary catheter and then gets into the urinary tract. And this is aggravated either because of intraluminally breaking the closed drainage system or contamination of the collection bag, or extraluminally during insertion or later by bacteria just migrating through. So in terms of prevention, once we understand, like a central line, we need to have aseptic insertion technique. We need to have the smallest catheter and the balloon possible. We need to remove the urinary tract as soon as we do not need it. Always maintain a closed drainage system. Keep the collection device below the level of the bladder so that there is no reflux of urine that is happening. Clamping of the catheter is prohibited. Clamping is a routine practice. There is absolutely no scientific rationale to clamp the catheter. It's been associated with increased chances of infection and reflux. Good perineal care will prevent the colonization. No antibiotic prophylaxis like we talked about for central line is very, very important. There is not much evidence in terms of using silicone catheters. The common question I get asked is, can I put a silicone catheter and prevent a urinary tract infection? The chances are you will still get a urinary tract infection. It is not very effective in terms of preventing a urinary tract infection at this point of time, but you can consider using it for other reasons if you think the patient is going to need a catheter for more than 2 weeks. So quickly concluding my talk, first message I want to give you is CRBSI is not the same as CLABSI, even though the terms are used interchangeably. CLABSI is a loose definition used for surveillance. CRBSI is a more stringent definition used very specifically for which we need a quantitative culture. The diagnosis of CRBSI relies on a quantitative blood culture and the catheter tip culture and differential time to positivity between the central and the peripheral venous culture. That's something that you need to be very clear. Hand hygiene and maximal sterile barrier precautions are the two most effective ways of preventing central line infections, along with appropriate site selection. And the next step is, once the line is in, we need to make sure we assess the need for the line every day and try to remove it as quickly as possible. And we need to monitor regularly our incidence of these infections, complications related to the central line, and keep altering our practice so that the process gets more smoother and safer with less complications. In terms of urinary tract infections, it's very, very easily avoidable. Place the urinary catheter only when indicated. There's no role for routine urinary catheterization in the ICU. Make sure that aseptic precautions are followed during placement. You remember that the smallest size of the catheter is probably more than adequate. Maintain a closed system at all times. Do not break the barriers. Do not open the system to sample. Urinary bag and tube should always be below the level of the catheter. Do not clamp the catheter. Do not allow the urine to reflux by lifting the bag above, and promptly removing the catheter and making sure that we audit it carefully like the central line prevents the infections. I'm going to stop my talk here and thank you for your attention. Thank you.